The rain came down in long silver threads over Park Avenue that October evening, the kind of rain that made the city look like it was crying, without knowing why. Inside a black town car parked outside the Whitmore building, a woman sat very still in the back seat, watching the droplets race each other down the tinted window. Her name was Catherine Whitmore, and at 44 years old, she was one of the most powerful women in New York. People who had never met her still knew her name. They knew the buildings she owned, the board she sat on, the charities that bore her signature in gold lettering at the bottom of every brochure. They knew the cold, careful smile she wore in photographs. And they knew that smile had not changed in the 8 years since her husband Richard had died of a heart attack in the back of a limousine very much like this one. What they did not know was that Catherine Whitmore was, in that moment, holding her phone so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, waiting for a call from a school nurse who had told her, only 20 minutes earlier, that her son had collapsed during recess and was being taken by ambulance to St. Vincent's Children's Hospital. She did not cry. Catherine Whitmore had not cried in public or in private since the morning she buried her husband. Crying, she had learned a long time ago, was a habit of people who believed someone might come and fix things if they made enough noise. Catherine had stopped believing that when she was 9 years old, in a small apartment in Queens, watching her mother sob over an eviction notice that no amount of weeping had ever softened. By the time she clawed her way out of that apartment, through scholarships and sleepless nights and a marriage to a man twice her age who had taught her everything about money and almost nothing about love, she had built a private rule for herself, a rule she repeated like a prayer whenever the world tried to break her. Tears are for people who have no other tools. You have tools, Catherine. Use them. But her son was the one tool she could not use, the one weapon she could not wield, the one thing in the entire stainless steel architecture of her life that did not belong to her. Ethan Whitmore was 8 years old. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray, watchful eyes, and a way of looking at the world, as though he were quietly translating it into a language only he understood. He drew pictures of stars on every piece of paper he could find, on the backs of Catherine's quarterly reports, on the inside covers of her leather-bound legal documents, on the napkins at restaurants where the waiters pretended not to notice. He was a quiet boy. He was a gentle boy. And he was, Catherine knew with the kind of clarity that only mothers have, the only living thing in the world she would burn her entire empire to protect. The phone rang. She answered before the first ring had finished. Mrs. Whitmore. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Hannah Reyes, the head of pediatric cardiology at St. Vincent's. Catherine had met her exactly once, 3 years ago, at a fundraising gala. She remembered her as competent and tired, which was the only kind of doctor Catherine trusted. I need you to come to the hospital. Quickly. But carefully. He's stable. But I have to be honest with you. What we're looking at is serious. How serious? Catherine's voice did not shake. It never did. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that doctors used when they were choosing which truth to tell first. Your son has a condition called dextrocardia with situs inversus. His heart is on the right side of his chest instead of the left, and several of his internal organs are mirrored. It's extremely rare. He's lived with it his whole life without any of us knowing, which is, frankly, a small miracle. But there's a secondary complication, a structural defect in the heart itself, and it appears to be deteriorating faster than we'd like. What does he need? Surgery, Mrs. Whitmore. A very specific kind of surgery. And I have to warn you, there are perhaps 5 surgeons in this country who could even attempt it. Maybe fewer. Catherine closed her eyes. The rain kept falling. Somewhere ahead through the windshield, the city lights bled into long red and yellow smears, and for a moment she felt as though the car were not moving at all, as though the entire world had stopped, and only the rain was still doing its job. Get me their names, she said. All of them. I don't care what they cost. I don't care where they are. Get me their names by the time I reach the hospital. She hung up before Dr. Reyes could answer. By the time the town car slid up to the emergency entrance of St. Vincent's, Catherine had already made 4 calls. She had moved a board meeting. She had cleared her schedule for the next 2 weeks. She had instructed her assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had learned long ago not to ask questions, to wire $1 million into an accessible account by morning. And she had told her driver, a man named Marcus, who had been with her for 9 years, that he was to go home and sleep because she did not know when she would need him next, and she preferred her tools to be rested. The hospital lobby smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. The marble floors had been mopped recently and were still faintly damp under the soles of her heels. She walked through the corridors with the same straight-backed certainty. She walked into boardrooms, and the staff parted around her without quite knowing why, because Catherine Whitmore carried her authority the way other people carried umbrellas, instinctively, without thinking about it. She was led up to the 7th floor, the pediatric intensive care unit, where Dr. Reyes was waiting outside a glass-walled room with a clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. Inside the room, on a bed that looked far too large for him, lay Ethan. He was awake. He was small. There were wires running from his chest, and a soft beeping sound that was somehow the loneliest sound Catherine had ever heard in her life. He saw her through the glass and lifted one small hand, and she lifted hers in return, and for one terrible instant she thought she might break apart right there in the hallway, in front of the nurses, in front of the strangers, in front of God. She did not. She walked into the room, sat down beside her son, took his hand, and said, in the steadiest voice she had ever produced, "Sweetheart, Mommy's here, and Mommy is going to fix this." She did not yet know that there are some things even Catherine Whitmore could not fix. She did not yet know that, 3 floors below her, an old man with a mop bucket was beginning his shift. And she did not yet know that, by the time the sun came up over Manhattan again, the only person in the world who could save her son would be the one person her family had spent 32 years pretending did not exist. The first surgeon arrived at 6 o'clock the next morning, before the sky had even decided what color it wanted to be. His name was Dr. Edward Caldwell, and Catherine had paid for a private jet to bring him in from Boston. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, with the brisk, efficient manner of a man who had stopped being impressed by wealthy clients somewhere around his 40th birthday. He took one look at Ethan's charts in the small consultation room down the hall from the ICU, and Catherine watched his face the way a gambler watches the dealer's hands, looking for the smallest tell, the smallest sign of which way the night was going to break. She did not have to watch long. Dr. Caldwell set the charts down on the table with the careful gentleness of a man placing flowers on a grave, and he looked up at her with an expression she would come to know very well over the next 24 hours. It was an expression that said, "I am sorry, but no." "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, in a voice that had clearly been rehearsed on the plane, "I cannot operate on your son. The combination of conditions he presents is extraordinarily rare, and the surgical technique required has not been successfully performed in this country in nearly 2 decades. I would be putting a child on the table, with very little chance of bringing him off it again. I'm afraid I cannot, in good conscience, accept that responsibility." $1 million, Catherine said, very calmly, as though she were offering him a glass of water. "Cash. Tonight. No questions. No paperwork. Just save my son." Dr. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment, and Catherine saw something flicker across his face that might have been pity, or might have been something closer to embarrassment for her, for the fact that she had spent her entire life learning to solve problems with money and was only now, at 44 years old, discovering that there were rooms in the world where her money did not even reach the doorknob. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I have a daughter. I have a wife. I have a 30-year reputation and a teaching position at Harvard that depends entirely on the assumption that I do not gamble with children's lives for money. I'm very sorry. The answer is still no." He left at 6:27 in the morning. Catherine watched him walk down the corridor without looking back, and she did not move from her chair for almost a full minute. The second surgeon arrived from Cleveland at 10. The third from Houston at 1 in the afternoon. The fourth from Los Angeles at 4. Each of them was the best in his particular corner of the country. Each of them was paid handsomely simply to fly in and consult. Each of them sat in the same small consultation room, looked at the same set of scans, listened to the same offer of $1 million, and each of them, in his own particular language of regret, said no. One was kind about it. One was clinical. One looked almost angry, as though he resented being asked to refuse. And the fourth, a man from California with very white teeth and very tired eyes, said something that would stay with Catherine for the rest of her life. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, "I want you to understand something. There are perhaps 2 men alive today who could perform this operation with any reasonable expectation of success, and neither of them is in this hospital. One of them is in his 80s and no longer practices. The other one, I am told, disappeared from medicine many years ago under circumstances no one will fully explain to me. So when I tell you that I cannot operate on your son, I am not telling you that I do not want to. I am telling you that the world has run out of the kind of hands he needs. I'm sorry. I truly am. But there are some things, ma'am, that even your name cannot buy." Catherine did not respond. She sat in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, and she waited until he had left the room and the door had closed behind him before she allowed her shoulders to drop just a fraction of an inch, just enough that anyone watching closely would have seen the first small crack in the architecture of her composure. The 5th surgeon arrived at 9 that evening, the last name on a list that had felt very long that morning and now felt impossibly short. He was a younger man, only 40, brought in from a teaching hospital in Pennsylvania. He had a reputation for taking cases that other surgeons refused. He was, by every metric Catherine's assistant had been able to gather, her best remaining hope. He spent 40 minutes with Ethan's files. He spent another 20 in the room itself, watching the boy sleep, his expression unreadable. And then he came out into the corridor and told Catherine, very gently, that he was going to go home and think about it, and that he would call her in the morning. He called at 4:47 in the morning. He did not say much. He said that he had spent the night reading every paper he could find on the procedure, and that the success rate, in the hands of even the most experienced surgeons, was somewhere between 15 and 20%. He said that in his own hands, with no prior experience of this specific combination of conditions, the rate would be lower. He said that he had a wife and 2 small children, and that he had built his entire career on careful selection of cases he could actually win. He said he was sorry. He said he wished he were a braver man. Catherine thanked him for his honesty. She hung up the phone. She walked down the corridor to the small hospital chapel on the 5th floor, a room she had passed several times over the previous day, without ever really noticing it existed. It was empty. The lights were low. There was a single stained glass window above a small wooden altar, and a row of plain pews, and the smell of old wax and older prayers. She sat down in the back pew, very straight, very composed, and for a long moment she did nothing at all. She simply sat. And then, without warning, without permission, without any of the careful internal scaffolding she had spent her entire adult life building, Catherine Whitmore began to cry. She cried the way a person cries when they have finally understood that the wall they have been pushing against their whole life is not a wall at all but the side of a mountain, and that no matter how hard they push, the mountain is not going to move. She cried for her son. She cried for the 8-year-old girl in Queens she had once been. She cried for her husband, who she had not loved well, and for her mother, who she had not visited often enough, and for every person she had ever walked past without seeing because she had been too busy being important. She cried until her throat hurt, and then she sat in the dim quiet of the chapel and tried to remember how to breathe. When she finally stood up, almost an hour later, and walked back toward the 7th floor with the crumpled $1 million check still folded inside her coat pocket, she passed an old man in a janitor's uniform pushing a mop bucket down the corridor. She did not see him. He saw her. He saw the way her shoulders carried a weight that money cannot lift. He saw the redness around her eyes that she had tried and failed to hide. He paused for just a moment, leaning on the handle of his mop, and he watched her go. Then he turned very slowly and looked through the glass wall of room 714, where a small boy lay sleeping with his heart on the wrong side of his chest. And something very old and very quiet woke up inside Samuel Carter's eyes. It was 2:47 in the morning when the world finally went quiet on the 7th floor of St. Vincent's Children's Hospital. The shift change had come and gone an hour earlier. The night nurses had settled into the soft rhythm of their rounds, and the long fluorescent corridor outside the pediatric intensive care unit had emptied of everything but the low electric hum of the building itself, That almost sound that hospitals make at night, half machine and half memory. Catherine Whitmore sat in a plastic chair outside room 714 with her coat folded across her lap and the crumpled check still tucked inside the inner pocket. She had not slept in 31 hours. Her hair, which she usually kept pulled back with a kind of architectural precision, had fallen loose around her face. Her mascara had smudged in the chapel, and she had not bothered to fix it. For perhaps the first time in 2 decades, Catherine Whitmore looked exactly as tired as she actually was. She had stopped making phone calls. She had run out of names. The fifth surgeon's apology was still sitting in her voicemail, unlistened to a second time, and somewhere on the floor above her, Dr. Reyes was preparing to come down at 7 in the morning to have a conversation Catherine already knew the shape of. We can keep him comfortable, Mrs. Whitmore. We can give him time. But we cannot give him the operation he needs. Catherine had been in enough boardrooms to recognize the particular cadence of a conversation that was about to ask her to accept the unacceptable. And so she sat. She watched her son breathe through the glass. She counted the rises and falls of his small chest, and she made herself a promise that she had not yet figured out how to keep, that she was not going to let him die in this building, in this city, in this lifetime, no matter what it cost her. She heard the wheels of the mop bucket before she saw the man pushing it. It was a soft, uneven sound, the kind of sound that belonged to old equipment and older hands, and it rolled slowly down the corridor toward her from the far end of the hall. Catherine did not turn her head. She was used to invisible people. She had spent her whole life moving through buildings cleaned by hands she had never shaken, served by people whose names she had never learned. And she did what wealthy people in cities like New York have always done, which is to look slightly above and slightly past, as though the work of keeping the world running were being performed by a kind of weather rather than by other human beings. The wheels slowed. Then they stopped. Catherine became aware, the way one becomes aware of a sudden change in temperature, that the man had paused in front of room 714 and was no longer moving. She turned her head. He was an older black man, perhaps 68, perhaps older, with closely cropped gray hair and a face that had clearly known a great deal of weather. He wore the pale blue uniform of the hospital's janitorial staff, with a name tag pinned slightly crooked above his left chest pocket. His hands rested lightly on the handle of his mop. He was not looking at Catherine. He was looking through the glass at her son, and there was something about the stillness in him, something about the way he was looking, that made Catherine sit up a little straighter in her chair. It was not the look of a stranger glancing into a room out of idle curiosity. It was the look of someone reading a book he had not opened in a very long time and was surprised to find he still remembered the words. "Can I help you?" Catherine said, more sharply than she had meant to. She was not in the mood to be observed. She was certainly not in the mood to be observed by the night janitor. The man did not flinch. He turned his head slowly and looked at her, and his eyes were the kind of brown that has seen too many mornings to be impressed by any one of them. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was quiet and unhurried, and carried in it the small, soft echo of a southern childhood that had never quite left him. "I am very sorry to intrude. I will move along directly. I only wanted to ask you one thing, if you'll permit it, and then I'll go." Catherine stared at him. Under any other circumstance, in any other corridor, on any other night of her life, she would have said no. She would have said it coldly, and she would have meant it, and the man would have apologized and pushed his mop bucket down the hall, and that would have been the end of it. But she had been crying in a chapel an hour ago. She had run out of names. She had run out of doors to knock on. And there was something in the way this old man was holding his mop, the way another man might hold a hat in a church, that made her give him an answer she did not entirely understand. "Ask," she said. He looked back at the glass. He looked at Ethan for what felt like a long time. And then he said, very quietly, almost as though he were asking it of himself rather than of her, "Ma'am, the boy in there, is his heart on the wrong side?" Catherine felt the air leave the corridor. She did not answer right away. She could not. Dextrocardia with situs inversus was a condition so rare that 2 of the 5 surgeons who had flown into this hospital in the last 24 hours had needed to look up specific details before they would consult on it. It was not a condition you guessed at from a hallway. It was not a condition you intuited from the glass. It was a condition you knew, with the specific and particular knowledge of a man who had once held a heart like that in his own two hands. How? She said. Her voice was not steady anymore. How could you possibly know that? The old man did not answer immediately. He stepped a little closer to the glass, very gently, the way a person approaches a wild animal he does not wish to startle, and he looked at her son for another long moment. And then he leaned forward, almost as though he were speaking to the boy through the wall, and he whispered a single word, and the word was not English, not exactly, but it was a word Catherine had heard 4 times in the last 2 days, spoken by 4 different surgeons in 4 different consultation rooms, every one of them with a particular grave weight, as though the word itself were a door that none of them were willing to walk through. Tetralogy, he said. Catherine stood up so quickly that her coat slid off her lap and onto the floor. She did not bend to pick it up. The check that had been folded inside the pocket spilled out onto the linoleum, a crumpled paper rectangle with 7 figures written on it, and neither of them looked at it. The man kept his eyes on the glass. Catherine kept her eyes on the man, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt the particular vertigo of looking at a person she had walked past 100 times without ever once asking who they used to be. "Who are you?" she said. The old man turned, finally, and looked at her fully. There was no pride in his face. There was no resentment. There was only a kind of quiet, ancient grief, and underneath it, like a small light at the bottom of a very deep well, something that almost looked like relief, as though he had been waiting 32 years to be asked exactly that question by exactly the right person. "My name is Samuel Carter," he said softly. "And ma'am, a long time ago, before this mop, before this uniform, before this building forgot what my hands used to do, I was the only surgeon in this country who knew how to fix a heart like the one your boy was born with." Catherine Whitmore, who had not believed in God since she was 9 years old in a small apartment in Queens, found herself reaching out one trembling hand to steady herself against the cold glass wall of room 714. For a long moment Catherine could not speak. She stood with her palm pressed flat against the cold glass of room 714, and inside that room her son slept on, unaware that the entire shape of his future had just shifted in a hospital corridor at 3 o'clock in the morning. The man in front of her, the man whose name tag read S. Carter, Environmental Services in small white letters, stood very still with his hands resting on the handle of his mop, and he waited, with the patience of a person who has spent 32 years waiting for things, while Catherine Whitmore tried to remember how to breathe like a person who lived in a world she still understood. "Come with me," she finally said. Her voice did not sound like her own. "Please. There's a family room down the hall. I need to sit down. And I need you to tell me everything." He hesitated. She saw him glance, almost reflexively, at the long corridor behind him, the way a man glances at a door he has been told not to walk through. Then he gave a small nod, and he leaned the mop carefully against the wall beside his bucket, and he followed her down the hall with the quiet, dignified slowness of a person who had taught himself, over many years, never to walk faster than the space he was allowed to occupy. The family room was small and beige and smelled faintly of stale coffee. There were 2 soft chairs and a low table and a box of tissues that someone had clearly refilled that morning. Catherine sat down in one chair. Samuel Carter sat down, after a polite hesitation, in the other. He held his hands together in his lap. They were large hands with long fingers, and Catherine noticed, now that she was looking, that they did not quite match the rest of him. They were not the hands of a man who had spent 30 years pushing a mop. They were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years trying not to remember what they had been built to do. "Tell me," she said. "Please. From the beginning." He looked down at his palms for a moment, as though he were reading something written there in a language only he could see. And then, in a voice that was quiet but did not waver, Samuel Carter began to tell Catherine Whitmore the story of his life. He had been born in 1957, he said, in a small town outside Charleston, South Carolina, the youngest of 7 children, the son of a woman who cleaned houses and a man who drove a delivery truck. His mother had decided when he was 4 years old, watching him take apart and reassemble an old radio on the kitchen floor, that he was going to be a doctor. He had not particularly agreed with her at the time. He had wanted to be a baseball player. But his mother was a woman who believed that the Lord had given her 7 children for 7 specific reasons, and that her job was to figure out what each reason was, and then to push that child toward it, gently and relentlessly, for the rest of her natural life. She had pushed him through high school, where he was the only black student in his honors science class. She had pushed him through Morehouse, where he had graduated near the top of his class. And she had pushed him in the autumn of 1979 through the front doors of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where he became one of the first black students ever admitted into their pediatric surgical training program. She had not lived to see him finish. He had buried her in the spring of his 3rd year in a small church cemetery outside Charleston, and he had returned to Baltimore 3 days later and operated on a 6-month-old infant with a transposition of the great arteries because there had been no one else available that night, and the child had lived, and he had not slept for 40 hours, and somewhere in the middle of it all, he had quietly decided that for the rest of his life he was going to spend every waking hour trying to deserve the woman who had carried him out of that small town in South Carolina. By 1985, he was Dr. Samuel Carter, board-certified in cardiothoracic surgery, with a specialty in pediatric cases and a particular interest, he said softly, in the rarest of all the rare conditions, the mirrored hearts, the inverted anatomies, the children whose bodies had been put together in ways that almost no surgeon in the country knew how to repair. He had developed a technique. He had published 2 papers on it. By 1987, there were 5 surgeons in America who were working on procedures for dextrocardia with situs inversus, and Samuel Carter, the janitor sitting in front of Catherine in a small beige room at 3 in the morning, had been the youngest of them, and by every honest measure that any of his colleagues had been willing to put on paper, the most gifted. And then, he said, very quietly, came the autumn of 1987. There had been a child, a boy 4 years old, brought in from out of state by a family with a great deal of money and a great deal of influence. The child's heart had been one of the most complicated cases Samuel had ever seen, a combination of conditions so unlikely that the medical literature contained, at the time, only 6 recorded examples in the entire world. He had told the family, plainly and honestly, before he ever touched the boy, that the survival rate for this kind of operation was perhaps 1 in 5, possibly lower. He had told them that he believed he could do it, but that he could not promise it. He had told them, twice, that they were welcome to take the child elsewhere for a second opinion. They had not. They had told him to operate. The boy had died on the table, not because of anything Samuel had done, not because of any error or hesitation or misstitch. He had died because his heart, as Samuel had warned them, had been built in a way that almost nothing built by human hands could fix. Samuel had walked out of the operating room at 4 in the morning, and he had sat down in a small beige family room very much like the one he was sitting in now, and he had told the boy's father, gently and honestly, that he was deeply, deeply sorry, and that he had done everything that medicine, in 1987, knew how to do. The boy's father had not said anything in that room. He had stood up. He had walked out. And then, very quietly, over the course of the next 6 months, he had used every dollar and every connection and every favor that his name could buy to ensure that Dr. Samuel Carter would never again hold a scalpel inside the borders of the United States. The hospital board, terrified of a lawsuit, had not defended him. His colleagues, terrified of the same father, had not testified. His license had been suspended pending review, then revoked entirely, then quietly, permanently, never restored. There had been no headlines. There had been no scandal. There had only been the slow, patient erasure of a man's career by another man who needed the world to believe his son had died because somebody had failed him, rather than because some children, even now, even with the best hands in the world, simply cannot be saved. Samuel had lost everything that year. His position, his income, his marriage eventually, because grief and shame are corrosive to even the strongest of houses. He had worked, in the years that followed, wherever a man with no license and a ruined name could find work. Maintenance, custodial, night shifts, hospitals, eventually, because the smell of antiseptic was the only smell that still made him feel like the version of himself he had once been. He had ended up at St. Vincent's 6 years ago. He had mopped these floors. He had emptied these bins. He had walked past room 714 perhaps 2,000 times. And the father, Catherine said very quietly, because she already knew, because some part of her had known from the moment he had said 1987, and the small specific shape of the year had landed in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. The father of the boy. What was his name? Samuel Carter looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were very kind, which somehow made it worse. His name was Richard Whitmore, ma'am, he said softly. I believe he was your husband. Catherine did not move. She did not speak. For perhaps 30 seconds, in the small beige family room on the 7th floor of St. Vincent's Children's Hospital, she simply sat with her hands resting in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance between herself and the man across from her. And she allowed the full weight of what he had just said to find its way through the careful corridors of her body and settle, finally, in the deepest chamber of her chest. Her husband. Her late husband. The man whose name was carved into the marble lobby of the building she owned on 57th Street. The man who had given her her son. The man who had 32 years ago, in the long quiet aftermath of his own first marriage and his own first child's death, used every weapon his fortune had ever forged to destroy the only doctor in the country who could have saved that child, and who could, perhaps, still save the next one. He never told me, she said. The words came out very small. He never told me he had a son before me. He never told me any of it. Samuel Carter nodded slowly. I expect he didn't, ma'am. Some men carry their griefs in rooms they don't let anyone else into. And some men, when their grief turns into rage, build the room with concrete so no light can ever get back inside. I knew your husband for a total of perhaps 4 hours in this life. I am not the man to tell you who he was. I can only tell you what he did. Catherine put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the chapel. What moved through her now was something quieter and more terrible than tears. The slow, precise understanding that the architecture of her entire adult life had been built on a foundation she had never once asked to inspect. The penthouse, the buildings, the boards, the careful, untouchable name. All of it had been bought in some small, invisible measure, with the silence of a man who had been mopping the floor outside her son's hospital room for the last 6 years. She lifted her head. She looked at Samuel Carter, and, in the most level voice she could manage, she asked him the only question that mattered. Sam, she said, and she did not realize until afterward that she had used his first name. If I could get you back into that operating room, if I could get the board to authorize it, if I could get every signature, every waiver, every piece of paper they need, would you save my son? He did not answer right away. He looked down at his hands. He turned them over slowly, palms up, palms down, as though he were checking to see whether they were still the same hands he had last used inside a child's chest in the autumn of 1987. And then he looked up at her, and Catherine saw something in his face that she had not expected to see, something that was not pride and was not anger and was not even forgiveness, but was instead a deep and almost unbearable tenderness, the tenderness of a man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for a chance to become himself again. Ma'am, he said quietly, I never stopped being a doctor. They just took the paper. Catherine stood up. She walked out of the family room. She did not go back to her chair outside room 714. She went directly to the nurse's station, picked up the phone, and at 3:26 in the morning, she began making the most important phone calls of her life. She called the chief of surgery. She called the hospital president at home, in bed, and she did not apologize for the hour. She called her attorneys. She called the chairman of the hospital's board of trustees, a man who had attended her husband's funeral and her last 3 charity galas. She did not ask any of them. She told them. She told them what was going to happen in the next 4 hours. And she told them what she was prepared to do, publicly and expensively and without mercy, if it did not. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Catherine Whitmore walked into a wood-paneled boardroom on the 3rd floor of St. Vincent's and stood in front of 11 people in suits and told them, without sitting down, the entire truth. About her husband, about 1987, about the boy who had died, about the doctor who had been erased, about the records she suspected that were still buried somewhere in this very hospital's archives. and about the 8-year-old child upstairs in room 714, whose only remaining chance at life was sitting in a janitor's break room at the end of the corridor, drinking a cup of coffee out of a paper cup. The room was silent for a very long time. And then at the far end of the table, an elderly man with thick white eyebrows and a slightly crooked tie cleared his throat. His name was Dr. Howard Lynn. He was 76 years old. He was retired. He sat on the board now in an advisory capacity. And in 1986 and 1987, before any of it had happened, he had been Samuel Carter's senior colleague at this hospital, and one of the very few men who had refused, quietly and at great cost to his own career, to sign the document that ended Sam's life as a surgeon. "I will co-sign the emergency authorization," Dr. Lynn said, in a voice that was steady and unhurried. "I will scrub in beside him. I will take legal and professional responsibility for everything that happens in that operating room. If any of you would like to vote against me, I would invite you to do so on the record, so that 30 years from now, when somebody writes this story down, your name will be in it." Nobody voted against him. At 9:41 that morning, Dr. Samuel Carter scrubbed in for the first time in 32 years. His hands shook at the sink. Then they steadied. The young surgical nurses watched him with a polite skepticism that lasted exactly until the first incision, at which point one of them, a woman named Rosa, would later tell her husband over dinner that she had felt, standing in that operating room, as though she were watching a man remember how to fly. The operation took 6 hours and 47 minutes. At 4:28 in the afternoon, the doors of operating room 3 opened, and Samuel Carter walked out with his mask hanging loose around his neck and his eyes wet and tired and impossibly alive, and he found Catherine Whitmore standing in the corridor exactly where he had left her, and he said 4 words that she would carry, intact and undamaged, for the rest of her natural life. "Your boy's gonna live." Ethan went home 11 days later. He drew a picture of stars on the back of the discharge paperwork, while a nurse signed the bottom. Within a month, he was running again. Within 3, he was back in school. Within a year, there was, somewhere in his small chest, a heart that beat steadily on the wrong side of his body, with a careful invisible signature of an old man's hands written into every chamber of it. Catherine did not give Sam the $1 million check. She gave him something he had stopped believing was still possible to give. She hired the best legal team in New York. She unsealed the 1987 records, every page of them, and she did not flinch at what she found inside her own husband's name. Within 18 months, Dr. Samuel Carter's medical license had been formally and publicly reinstated, with an apology from the state medical board and a settlement that, while it could not buy back 32 years, at least made it clear, on paper and in ink, that those years had been stolen rather than lost. And in the spring of a year that followed, Catherine Whitmore founded the Carter Foundation, a scholarship fund for black medical students pursuing pediatric cardiothoracic surgery. She put Sam in charge of it. He insisted on running it out of a small office on the same floor where he used to keep his mop bucket. A year after the operation, at the foundation's first gala, Catherine stood at the back of a crowded ballroom and watched her son holding Sam's hand near the dessert table, the two of them laughing at something only they understood. She walked over slowly. She knelt down beside Sam's chair, and she asked him, finally, the question she had been carrying since the night in the corridor. "That word," she said softly, "the one you whispered through the glass. Why did you say it? Why then?" Sam looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Ethan. He looked, somewhere, at a woman in a small church cemetery outside Charleston who had decided, 65 years earlier, that her youngest son was going to be a doctor. And he smiled. "Because the moment I saw your boy through that glass," he said, "I remembered who I was. And I figured, ma'am, if the Lord put me in that hallway with a mop in my hand at 3 o'clock in the morning, He must have put me there because somebody in this world still needed the doctor underneath." Catherine Whitmore had spent her entire life believing that $1 million could buy almost anything. She learned, in the small hours of one October night, that the most powerful things in this world do not have a price tag at all. They are standing right in front of us, holding a mop, or a name tag, or a tired smile at the end of a long shift, waiting, patiently and without bitterness, for somebody to finally look twice. We walk past them every day. the janitors, the cashiers, the strangers on the bus. We have no idea who they used to be. We have no idea who they could still become if only one of us, just once, were willing to stop and ask. So the next time you see a person the world has chosen to overlook, look at them carefully. Speak to them kindly. Remember that the hands holding the mop in front of you may, in some other life, have held a child's heart inside a chest and brought that child back to his mother. You do not know whose miracle is waiting for you to notice it. If this story touched your heart tonight, please like this video. Subscribe for more emotional stories like this one, and tell me in the comments the city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled tonight.